What happened to George Floyd is a horrific act of police brutality. This should never have happened, and we must ensure that it never happens here in Texas.
I don't need forgiveness for sounding angry. I am angry, and I am hurt, and I am sad, and you should be too.
Don't shoot!
Be angry, but we're still human. We gotta take care of each other.
This is America, and we speak a lot of different languages. You're gonna have to start speaking another language.
Hello, thank you for joining us for this special edition of State of Texas. I'm Josh Hinkle, and today I join you from the state capitol grounds near where protesters have been gathering for the past several days. The rallies bring thousands of people together to call for justice after the death of George Floyd and other African Americans who've died from the actions of police. Most of the protests have been peaceful, but some of the demonstrations have turned violent and led to damage here at the Capitol. Governor Greg Abbott called 1,500 DPS troopers to Austin, Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio to assist area law enforcement with demonstrators. The governor also summoned more than 1,000 Texas National Guard members to respond. For comparison, that's about a third of the 3,000 Guard members who have mobilized for the state's COVID-19 response. And it's far less than the 17,000 plus the governor activated for Hurricane Harvey. Our Wes Rappaport spoke with the governor about his response to the protests and whether he would call lawmakers back to the Capitol for a special session to address this.
Governor, what do you say to the Texans who see these protests or are participating in these protests? How do you as a state leader respond to the calls for change here?
Well, listen, my first response is one of anger because what happened to George Floyd is just horrific and should never happen. And we need to make sure that nothing like this ever happens in the state of Texas, because this is absolutely reprehensible what happened to him. And so there is a reason why people are angry and protesting about this. And, you know, it's part of the United States of America where people do have a First Amendment right to voice their complaints about actions like this. At the same time, we need to make sure that the protests remain free from violence, from vandalism, because the First Amendment does not authorize someone to throw a brick through a glass window and destroy somebody's property. That's exactly why we have law enforcement out to make sure that all protests remain peaceful.
Governor, you said the process to work on criminal justice reform needs to begin before the session in January. Do you mean that we need to start discussing these ideas, or do we need a special session to tackle legislation right now?
No, the way the legislative process works is obviously a session begins in January, and if you offer up a bill at that time, it's almost too late in the process. The way that bills are crafted in the state of Texas is they begin a half a year before the session begins. And so now is the time for legislators to start bringing up ideas, proposing ideas, testing those ideas with their fellow legislators, and they will get a feel for the art of the possibility of being able to pass meaningful legislation like we have so many times in the past that lead to reform that have made Texas one of the lead reform states in the country. But the process begins now with legislators beginning to work with each other on crafting meaningful legislation.
Wes joins us now. Now, Wes, the governor, he stopped short of saying that we needed to call a special session, but he did tell lawmakers to start crafting legislation right now.
Yeah, one of those pieces of legislation that has already been talked about and is on the table is from a Dallas area Democrat, Lorraine Birabel. She calls it her See Something, Say Something bill. And essentially what that does is it focuses on what people in society are already doing. If you see something, you should say something, but this applies to law enforcement if they see any kind of other police misconduct happening in their department. Another lawmaker who we've heard from is State Senator Boris Miles out of Houston. He says that he plans to refile some of his police oversight legislation. Just a couple of examples of that discussion already being happening here.
Previously, we've seen the governor call roundtables for things like school shootings, or last year when we had the mass violence in El Paso and the Midland, Odessa areas. Do we think that there's going to be anything like that this time?
Well, I asked the governor about that. He said that he is constrained a little bit by COVID-19 in terms of getting people together in person, but he does have plans in the works to have those discussions on a larger scale.
All right, Wes, thank you very much. Police in Austin and other Texas cities at times showed force against protesters. They used weapons like tear gas, rubber bullets, and beanbag guns, so-called less lethal force, but it can cause serious injuries. Our Kevin Clark has been investigating these tactics and the policies that allow them. A warning here, you're about to see some graphic images of injuries because we want to show you the effects that this less lethal force can have.
On several occasions over the weekend, protesters scattered as police fired what are considered to be less than lethal rounds.
Hi, I need an ambulance outside of the Austin.
Taylor Urbotz became emotional as he recalled watching a young man get shot in the back of the head with a beanbag round.
He just got hit and he went limp and he fell to the ground. Some people ran up to go see. He was not responsive.
Justin Howell was protesting here at APD, not even the intended target of an officer's beanbag round. According to the battalion, the 20-year-old Texas State student remains in critical condition. His family is allowing us to use this older photo of him. This widely shared video shows him lying on the ground after being shot in the back of the head by the round, which is considered by law enforcement to be less than lethal. Austin Police Chief Brian Manley says the officer was aiming for someone else who threw a water bottle and backpack. Medics carried him over to officers, but Chief Manley says officers opened fire again, hitting one of the medics trying to assist. Natalie Mullen was just feet away.
I was horrified. I remember screaming, like asking them, begging them to stop firing, asking who they were meaning to protect here.
State Rep Erin Zwiener of Hayes County said she reached out to the city of Austin for answers about what she calls an unacceptable use of force and says she'll be demanding accountability from Chief Manley.
We need to know who are these officers firing these shots? Why are they firing them? Were they ordered to? Are they acting against orders? And officers who are acting against orders should not be working in the police force.
These are photos of the kinds of injuries being sent to us. This one is the result of a beanbag round. Serious injuries that have landed some protesters in the hospital. EMS says 6 people were transported Sunday.
Being hit by a water bottle and then letting off 15 to 20 rounds of rubber bullets and into a crowd is deplorable.
Kevin Clark for State of Texas.
Thanks, Kevin. The public outcry led to action here in Austin. The Austin City Council held an emergency meeting Thursday to address the department's use of force on protesters. Chief Manley promised to change the department's policy.
What we are doing to make sure this does not happen to a single person ever again.
I will speak to some immediate changes that have been made to our deployment for the protest this week, and that is that the use of this beanbag ammunition will not be used in a crowd situation.
While Chief Manley vowed not to allow officers to fire beanbag rounds into crowds, he did say using those rounds is appropriate in other circumstances. State and federal investigators work to identify groups responsible for violence in some protests. Our investigation examines one group that's getting a closer look. Calls for justice after the in-custody death of an African-American woman led to action in the legislature. But the lawmaker behind the Sandra Bland Act says the protests show a few important things still need to be done. Protests in Austin have invoked the name of Mike Ramos. He was an unarmed man shot and killed by Austin police in April. His death is under investigation. One prominent group involved in the protest is calling itself the Mike Ramos Brigade, and it proclaims it is a militant organization. Our investigator Jody Barr found that that group has ties to something that's the focus of a federal and state investigation.
Mike Ramos Brigade is a militant organization.
Wait, he said they are a what type of organization?
Militant.
When you hear militant organization...
Yeah, I mean, they say we believe in militant organization. Riots are going to happen.
Emily Holmead was looking for a peaceful group to join to help protest in Austin when she ran across this Facebook page.
Mike Ramos Brigade, it's a community page. There's also, they've hidden all of their about stuff. You can't see the admins on it at all.
Holmead said she suspected the group was planning and carrying out some of the violence connected to the protest. She decided to attend this meeting the group held in a city park Monday. After the group asked a newspaper reporter to leave, Holmead said she decided to record the meeting. They didn't want it video recorded. They didn't want it shown.
No.
You chose to do that. Why?
I just felt like something fishy was going on, to be honest. And I wanted to know what was going on, because if they're still going out and protesting, I wanted to see why.
Mike Ramos Brigade is a militant organization. We believe in militant rebellion. First and foremost, we believe in organized militant rebellion. Riots are going to happen.
The day before this meeting, the Mike Ramos Brigade arranged an event on its Facebook page asking supporters to show up to the Capitol Plaza Target, which turned into a crime scene shortly after. The looting that happened here is now a state and federal investigation.
We're even aware of in terms of May 31st, the protest and looting of Target in Austin. Okay, that was done and organized by an Antifa webpage. And of course, the surveillance that was provided over the internet to identifying where law enforcement resources were staged was done over Antifa accounts. So there's no question that there is involvement of these violent extremists that are trying to exploit these things. I don't mind advertising this. We do have special agents embedded trying to identify criminals that are leveraging these or are using this as an opportunity, exploiting these demonstrations, and identify them, and we've already identified some of them, and we will be arresting them.
We tried to find the people behind the Mike Ramos Brigade, but we've had no luck. Even the man who canceled the Austin Justice Coalition rally at the Capitol Sunday says he doesn't know who's behind this group either.
This is that event Monday night. When you hear them say we're a militant organization, does that change the dynamic of all of this?
I mean, but I think that's who they want to be, though, right? Right? I think that's why, things like that is why I said I canceled the event, right?
Even Mike Ramos's mother doesn't know who's running the group using her son's name.
My son is dead. Have respect. I don't like the throwing, this and that. That's really disrespecting me, especially when I see having my son's name does not have nothing to do with that. And I do not know who they are.
Emily Holmead says she doesn't regret helping to expose this group and isn't afraid of any consequences for doing it.
If you have his own mother saying to not do it, why would you go against that?
Texas DPS Director Stephen McCraw says that investigators have identified some of the people involved in this looting and rioting across the state. But McCraw says they're not yet ready to release those names because investigators are still working to identify others involved in these crimes. And he says some of these charges could be federally prosecuted.
Now, this week you also did some more reporting on whether these groups could be tied to Antifa. What are security experts telling you?
Well, they're telling us that the violence involved in the protests that we've seen so far are indicative of some of the tactics of Antifa groups, meaning anti-fascists, that you see a clear split, Josh, between the peaceful protesters and then outside groups like Antifa type showing up, causing trouble here.
At least here in Austin, what we've seen when we run the backgrounds on the people that have been arrested is that most of them are coming from right here in the Austin area, not from out of state like other people have said have been happening in other places.
That's right. We have tracked each and every arrest here in the Austin area. Most of those people are right here from the Austin area, and we heard the DPS director say last week that the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force is here, and they are specifically looking for people who may be coming into the state of Texas who are involved in coordinating these riots and inciting riots and involved in some of the looting we've seen.
All right, Jody, thank you very much. Texas lawmakers faced calls to act after the death of an African-American woman in custody. It brought change, but it's still a work in progress.
We're working to make sure that this doesn't happen to you or your friends or others, and I'm always hopeful.
We talked to the lawmaker behind the Sandra Bland Act about what still needs to be done. Protests started in cities across Texas more than a week ago. The rallies brought tens of thousands of Texans together to call for racial justice. Most of those protests were peaceful. Some were not.
How can we make a change? How can we work together?
Number one, we have got to stand up for each other.
In Houston, former Austin Police Chief Art Acevedo marched with protesters through the 3rd Ward, where George Floyd grew up, the man whose killing sparked outrage throughout the U.S. Meanwhile, in Dallas, the city declared a state of disaster and enacted a curfew. Other Texas cities followed suit, including San Antonio, Denton, and Fort Worth. Similar to Austin, local police across the state unleashed tear gas and flashbangs to disperse crowds. While most of the unrest was centered in metropolitan areas, other communities faced their share as well.
I can't breathe! I can't breathe!
El Paso, Midland, and Amarillo all held their own events. No matter where the protest occurred, participants called for the same thing.
It's time for a change. The only way we're going to change is we have to come together as a people.
This week, while speaking out against police brutality, Governor Abbott said Texas has led the nation in criminal justice reform, specifically citing the Sandra Bland Act. It's named after a 28-year-old black woman who in 2015 was arrested during a traffic stop and found just days later hanging in her jail cell. Her death was ruled a suicide, but it led to protests over her arrest, allegations of racial violence against the state trooper involved, and the creation of that law, which requires police to complete racial profile training and 40 hours of de-escalation training. I spoke with the author of the Sandra Bland Act, Representative Garnet Coleman, who also represents the district in Houston where George Floyd grew up.
There's one portion that I think applies to these circumstances nationwide, and that's implicit bias training. You know, all of us have thoughts of view about people based on many different things, whatever they do for a living, their ethnicity, and we don't know we actually hold those. Those are deeply held but subconscious beliefs. And once we are aware of that, we can do something to change it. But unless we're aware of that, we can't change it. And I just couldn't get that in the law because of opposition by police unions. The other thing that I think is other policy that's extremely important is what's called pretext stops or Terry stops. And that's where officers use reasonable suspicion to pull someone over. And as we know, any interaction between a citizen of color and the police is likely or could end up in a violent circumstance. So the more stops, the more opportunity for those types of violent circumstances.
Have you gotten any indication from your colleagues or from those police unions that you talked about that there might be more support for some of those measures this time around?
I think all indicates that there will be or should be. You know, in the House, we formed a criminal justice caucus. That's a bipartisan criminal justice caucus. And we have a Republican chair, co-chair, and a Democratic co-chair. And that says a lot. Also, this time around, Governor Abbott made some very positive, or let's just say revealing comments about what happened in Minneapolis and in Minnesota that we didn't hear before. And I think that's a positive thing. The only person who doesn't seem to get it is Donald Trump.
George Floyd, whose death sparked so much of what we're seeing around the nation right now, grew up in the district where you live and represent. Is there a message that you want to share with his family or your constituents who feel that personal tie?
We all mourn for the family and consider them our friends and neighbors and family. What I say to them is, don't lose heart that you have people who are going to work on behalf of preventing these circumstances in the future. And what I say to my constituents and what I say to my son and daughter, we're working to make sure that this doesn't happen to you or your friends or others. And I'm always hopeful. You have to be hopeful. But that doesn't change the fact that this was a tragic, unnecessary circumstance for a 46-year-old man to lose his life based on being pulled over by the police.
Coleman said it's important for lawmakers to begin holding hearings so they can build on the Sandra Bland Act and craft legislation ahead of the next session. The protests this week have put the spotlight on divisions that seem so deep, but up next, we'll look at how it also brought people together with the goal of positive change. Protests this week have put the spotlight on issues that do not have easy answers. Sometimes the results have been disturbing, bringing out anger and violence. But it's also important to remember that most of the people that have attended these rallies have been peaceful, and that seeing them together brings the hope that there can be common good to work for justice. Thank you for joining us for this special edition of State of Texas. I'm Josh Hinkle. We'll be back next week to bring you an in-depth look at Texas politics. Have a great day.